Hello, and welcome to A Coffee Buyer's Guide to Contract Terms. Hey folks, I'm Chris Kornman. I'm the Lab and Education Manager at the Crown, and I'm excited to be talking to you about some common coffee buying terms. We're going to cover a number of different pieces of language that coffee buyers and sellers will use that can sometimes be confusing for people who don't know the business terribly well. This is generally speaking an overview, but we will get into some detailed information about transactions, about sampling, and a number of other topics. Stay tuned. The Crown is located at 2523 Broadway in Oakland, California. We're a lab and tasting room, as well as an event space and education center. You can read more about us online. Royal Coffee is the parent company of the Crown, family-owned and operated importer in business since 1978 in the Bay Area. And you are on our website right now. There are a ton of perks to being a coffee buyer. Traveling to origin, meeting producers, experiencing the coffee harvest. As glamorous as all this can be, there's also a ton of work that can come between a farm visit and the first production roast. Coffee must be sampled and approved, shipping and insurance must be arranged, and payment terms must be settled upon. All this work would be worthless without the appropriate tools for understanding and crafting good contracts. Today we'll look at a number of common terms used for drawing coffee contracts, including understanding and crafting these contracts, understanding samples and quality approvals, working with shipping terms and different types of shipments, understanding container loads, and working around payment terms. Mutually amicable and agreed upon contracts are critical to the health and longevity of trade relationships, whether it's a long-term direct trade partnership or even just a one-time transaction. Using common language for coffee buying and shipping can help avoid confusion and streamline a lengthy, complicated process. Let's take a look at some of the most common contract terms and their definitions, including some of the most important ways that contracts describe sampling, quality, transfer of risk, and payment. Tasting and approving samples prior to purchase is a critical stage in the coffee buying process. At many different steps along the supply chain, coffee may be sampled for physical and sensory quality in various states of prep. Let's disambiguate a couple of sample types. The first type of sample you might see referred to is actually called a type sample, and this is a non-representative sample, meaning it does not directly correspond to a specific lot of coffee that's for sale. This is often used as an introduction for new relationships. That is, this is the type of coffee that we often carry. It might be used as a substitute for many representative samples in a long-term high trust relationship. In this example, perhaps the producer would show one type sample for the 10 containers that they plan to sell a particular buyer that season, a single type sample rather than a representative sample. Representative or stock lot samples do in fact directly correspond to the coffee in question. Generally it refers to a specific quantity of coffee, although that quantity needs to be specified by the sampler, and it usually refers to coffee that's in a specified location. Representative samples typically draw from multiple bags of the same stock lot in an attempt to provide a holistic and accurate depiction of the coffee in question, but oftentimes standards can vary from warehouse to warehouse on how many bags to sample and what quantity to sample. Offer samples are representative or stock lot samples of coffee that's offered with a quantity available for purchase. This sample type is not often associated with an existing contract. However, if the buyer likes it, it might be used as a pre-ship approval in some cases. Pre-ship samples typically offered as fulfillment options for existing agreements are usually the point of no return for a buyer. The coffee in question might have already been milled and is ready for transporting, or the sample might have been specially prepared in advance of milling. In either case, the approval of a pre-shipment sample is taken as an agreement to fulfill the contract and to move forward with prepping and exporting the finished coffee to the buyer. Setting certain quality standards can be an important part of building a contract between a coffee buyer and seller. It's important to remember the various roles that different contributors along the supply chain will have in terms of quality at this point. A farmer might not have any control over the timeliness of ocean transit, or the screen sizes of their coffee, for example. Keeping this in mind, contracts and expectations should take into account when and where the coffee is being sampled and who is responsible for its preservation at any given point in time. If ocean transit is a concern, talk to the importer or the exporter. If screen size is of concern, the exporter or dry miller. A common term used in contracts is SAS, which means subject to approval of sample. This is where a buyer will sign a contract with a seller in advance of receiving a sample. However, fulfillment of that contract is entirely contingent on approval of the sample. The buyer does not need to purchase the coffee or even justify their decision. SAS terms may be indicated as no approval, no sale, NANS. Alternatively, they might be replace or repeat, meaning that in the event of a rejection, a new pre-shipment sample would be offered in place. In some cases, a seller might offer multiple options for the buyer at the same time. Select one of these 2 or 3 options to fulfill the contract. When a pre-shipment sample, a PSS, is approved and the coffee is shipped but arrives in a different state than expected, for example, diminished sensory quality or a higher physical defect count, for example, arbitration is often not necessary, and in my opinion, this should only be taken as a last resort. Typically, insurance does not cover these types of minor qualitative losses. The kinds of insurance that are taken out for coffee shipments tends to cover catastrophic loss only. Most frequently, shipments of a disappointing physical or sensory quality can result in quality claims or some sort of a compromise between the buyer and the seller. A quality claim would occur when the buyer requests a discount on a future purchase or perhaps a partial refund from the seller. These disputes can often be resolved amicably if communication channels are open and clear. The details of shipments, insurance, and ownership of risk can be intimidating for buyers and producers, particularly because of the propensity for those familiar with this side of the business to use abbreviations and industry-specific jargon. When a buyer commits to a coffee at a price per pound, that price per pound cost actually includes far more than just the product itself. It includes the cost of things like labor, fertilizer, post-harvest processing, storage, and the partial or total cost of shipping and insurance in varying degrees. This can depend greatly on the terms set forth in the contracts and may vary widely from transaction to transaction. As such, both the buyer and the seller should be crystal clear on who is responsible for what transportation, where, and when. Incoterms, that's abbreviation for International Commerce Terms, is a set of terms defined by the International Chamber of Commerce, and these are used broadly throughout commodity trading markets. They clarify exactly who is responsible for ensuring the coffee, in our case, gets to a predefined location and who assumes the risk. We use this transfer of risk terminology to understand who's accountable in the case of the loss or damage of the beans. Sometimes the party who pays for the transit is not the same party that owns the risk. Remember that for our purposes, in most cases, the seller is going to be an exporter or a producer, and the buyer is usually an importer or a roaster. These 3 terms are by far the most common and important for coffee buyers, and in fact, the first one is by default what most coffee purchases from a producing country being imported into a consuming country will be defined. FOB stands for free on board, and it means that the seller must deliver the coffee onto the ship at the port in the country of embarkation. That is, the coffee is loaded at the port, and any overland transportation costs from mills or warehouses to the port of origin must be paid by the seller. The buyer then agrees to book and pay for overseas shipping, insurance, and any drayage or transportation, customs, and overland freight costs incurred on the arrival to the port of destination. Let's unpack that just a little bit. FOB terms essentially roll the entire cost of production, the cost of growing, harvesting, processing, bagging, exporting, insurance, transit to the port, and loading onto the boat all into one, essentially a sticker price. So all of that pre-work that goes into loading a coffee up all the way until back until the point of the farm is rolled in as a single cost. FAS, free alongside ship, occurs when the seller relinquishes the risk at the dock rather than on the ship. It's one very small step. Essentially, the seller gets the coffee to the port, but the buyer must pay for it to be loaded onto the boat. FOT takes that transfer all the way back to usually a dry mill or a warehouse. FOT stands for free on truck, and it's the buyer, not the seller, that's required to organize and pay for overland transport to the dock and account for any loading and drayage fees at the port. This transfer of risk occurs when the coffee is loaded onto a truck rather than the boat, and it's specified at a given warehouse. FOT is often used in landlocked countries. Rwanda, for example, would be a common place to find an FOT contract, or Burundi for that matter. Coffees that must cross over international borders to be loaded onto a boat, essentially. FOB, FOT, and FAS terms are typically followed by the location of the transfer, e.g. FOB Buenaventura or FOT Kigali. These terms are of the utmost significance for direct trade buyers and coffee importers, as they are the most common for purchasing directly from a farmer or exporter. And if you're familiar with either the Pledge or the Specialty Coffee Transaction Guide, all of those prices that are published and most transparency reports issued by roasters are all in FOB terms. It's the most common for buying from origin. However, there are a number of additional terms that are worth knowing and learning. CRF or CIF, that would be cost and freight or cost insurance and freight, is much like FOB and FOT. CFR and CIF transfer risk once the coffee is on the ocean vessel. The difference here is that the seller, rather than the buyer, is responsible for contracting and paying for the overseas transit. So, in essence, the buyer owns the risk, but the seller must pay for the transportation over the ocean. In the case of CIF, the seller also provides that minimum insurance coverage. You can think of insurance for coffee in terms of sort of catastrophic insurance. In most cases, insurance is not going to cover minor quality loss. In both CIF and CRF, the location will be listed as the destination rather than the origin. So CFR New York would be the term for this particular contract. In EXW, which stands for Ex Works, sometimes Ex Warehouse, is a bit like FOT, except that it indicates that the buyer takes responsibility for overland transport without overland shipment. Ex Warehouse is the kind of term that you would use as a roaster buying directly from an importer rather than a producer. You're buying from a warehouse and you're paying for that transportation from the importer's warehouse to your warehouse. Most domestic coffee sales will transfer ownership this way. For example, a roaster will buy spot or arrived coffee, EXW, from the warehouse of an importer and also pay the additional cost of trucking to their facility. In the casual conversation, a trader might say ex-Oakland or ex-Continental, indicating the coffee is coming from a warehouse in Oakland or Continental terminals in New Jersey, respectively. FCA, CPT, and CIF are used less frequently. They stand for free carrier, carriage paid to, and carriage and insurance paid to. These are the land transit versions of CFR and CIF, and they essentially mean that the seller rather than the buyer is arranging and paying for overland transportation. FCA brings the coffee to the buyer's doorstep, while CPT and CIP will designate a specific location other than the buyer's address. DAT, DAP, DDP stand for delivered at terminal, delivered at place, or delivered duty paid. These indicate delivery terms in terms of risk, meaning that the buyer should not assume that the coffee will be delivered to their doorstep. Rather, the seller relinquishes the risk at the port terminal or another specified location, that would be the at place. Duty paid terms require the seller to also pay for import and customs. A buyer must then arrange for any fees not covered at the docks plus overland shipment and insurance. Those last two are FCA, CPT, and CIF, as well as the DAT, DAP, and DDP are rarely used in coffee transactions. In most cases, containers are shipped as full container loads, sometimes abbreviated FCL. This term, however, is loosely defined. Coffee can be packed in 60 to 70 kilo jute or similar fiber bags in most cases, although some bags are as low as 50 or even 35 kilos. Commonly used 20-foot containers are usually filled at around 325 60-kilo bags and as few as 275 70-kilo bags. These numbers vary slightly depending on the organization or the person stuffing the container, and that word stuffing is actually the industry term. In some cases, less than container loads are acceptable, LCLs, but keep in mind that shipping charges for both space and by weight, and as such it's cheaper pound for pound to ship at a full load. Partial containers are also more susceptible to damage during shipment because the contents are loose rather than packed solid. Generally speaking, a full container load of coffee is about 40,000 pounds, give or take, whereas a full contract on the C market is only 37,500 pounds. Additionally, it's very common to include advice of shipment in a contract. This requires the seller to advise the buyer as soon as possible of the date of embarkation and other relevant shipping line information. In addition to the shipping advice, the seller is almost always required to provide the buyer with a clean, that means the coffee appears not to have suffered damage in transit, bill of lading, sometimes abbreviated BL or BOL. This important document is necessary for clearing customs and is in many cases the trigger for a transfer of funds. The roaster or importer receives a clean bill of lading from the seller and then wires the money. Bill of lading in many cases traditionally has been viewed as a physical document, that is, the buyer will have to receive a paper copy. However, since the COVID-19 crisis in 2020, a lot of the physical document requirements have been dropped, and many buyers and sellers both are accepting digital proof. Incoterms highlight the complexity and importance of clarity in shipping. However, they really only refer to the shipping. They don't deal directly with the transfer of money or actual ownership. This is all done separately. In the case of a direct trade exchange or the purchase of a coffee in an FOB terms, for example, payments usually expected on the buyer's receipt of that bill of lading. This is typically in the form of a wire transfer, and again, it can happen either on receipt of a physical BL or the digital copy. It's pretty uncommon for exporters and farmers to extend credit to coffee buyers. Rather, it's usually the opposite. Farmers, exporters, or producers may request an official signed commitment from a buyer to purchase their coffee well in advance. This can enable the supplier to secure financing up front for the cost of processing and overland shipments, for example. Coffee growing and processing is often seen as a risky investment by bankers. Financing options can be pretty limiting for farmers without a committed buyer. However, credit terms from an importer to a roaster are also pretty common. A good credit application can result in a friendly relationship with the domestic coffee seller who's able to extend financing to the roaster. Credit terms typically cover two things: the amount to be paid and the time frame for that payment. A common example might be net 30, where a buyer has to resolve the unpaid balance, that's the net sum, within 30 days. Sometimes this might be preceded by an additional set of numbers, and in some cases a discount might be offered for early payments, and that might look like this: 2/10 net 30. In this example, the buyer has 30 days to pay their net balance, but if it's paid within 10 days, they receive a 2% discount. Coffee buying can be thrilling work, but to be successful, you should equip yourself with the appropriate tools and knowledge of the trade. Understanding contract terms and sampling procedures will go a long way towards securing great coffee and also enjoying excellent relationships with farmers, producers, suppliers, and vendors. I think the most important piece of advice that I can offer, though, is this: if you don't understand something, just ask. You've got so much less to lose by asking a question than by accepting terms to which you don't agree. I want to make mention and express my gratitude to Perfect Daily Grind, who first published a version of this in November of 2017. That's also been republished on Royal Coffee's blog with permission, and it's been linked in the handouts for your additional reading. You can, of course, always visit royalcoffee.com and check additional resources there, whether it's crown jewels or information on the crown itself, or our blog for further information and educational materials. And you can always come visit us at 2523 Broadway, or email us at info@royalcoffee.com, or dial the number below to get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.